interested in partnerships or interested in finding out more about the Accelerator, feel free to reach out. Right.
Hey guys, I'm YJ. I work in Defiance Capital. So I cover mostly investment research and also post investments in Defiance Capital. So we are a crypto-focused fund. Our existing fund is a hybrid fund where we invest in both primary and also secondary markets. Our second fund, a new fund, which is launching this month, is fully focused on secondary markets. And we are only focusing on crypto as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Ziheng, so from Saison Capital. So we are Southeast Asia focused early stage investor, but primarily do both Web2 fintech and Web3 crypto side of things. So the Web2 side we have started doing 3+ years, and then the Web3 side of things mostly started about 1 year ago, but growing very strong, already having a 20+ portfolio. Yeah.
Okay, and can we have Mackenzie?
All right, hi everyone. Mackenzie here from the investment team of Blockchain Panelist Fund. So we are early stage or global early stage Web3 VC. Started back in 2018 and are currently on our second fund. We had our first close last year. Predominantly investing in blockchain Web3 related startups. As of now, vertical agnostic so far. Invested into about 45 different companies just last year.
Okay, so for this panel today, we're discussing the investment landscape in open source and API first companies. We have a diverse panel, both from the Web2 and Web3 side of things. So to start things off, let's all be on the same page. We can talk about like what, whys, and hows of API first. So yeah, to start off, I could share what is an API first company to you.
Yeah, so for us, we have invested in a couple API first companies. So they are a data analytics company called Levitas, where they use their ethos of being API first companies is to aggregate all the open interest rates of different derivatives exchange and to allow their users to understand the markets of crypto derivatives better. So we have invested in that, and we thought that this would be good for transparency for not just professional traders, but also retail traders as well. We like their ethos and their vision behind it and invested in it previously.
I think for API first company, interestingly, this is not a new concept, right? I think the concept of API first has been around for 20+ years since the beginning of web internet. But I think it really became popular, gaining a lot of traction recently, just because I think the internet has become so interconnected these days. Like when I try to open a stock trading app, it asks me for my bank information. When I try to purchase insurance, it asks for my medical records. And I think it's because of this interconnectability, the concept of API first has becoming popular again. And I think for me, API first meaning if you can leverage the data or something has already built from another company, instead of being data first or coding first and writing out the code yourself, then why not just do it? So really leveraging on what other people has already done, extracting the data, extracting the services from other parties, and regroup or ensemble into a collection of APIs, both internal, externally, and that's for me, yeah, API first.
Okay, so we have the importance of transparency and the importance of interconnectivity, as well as like leveraging on work that companies internal and external have done. Could we also have Mackenzie? What does API first mean to you?
Right, so I think API is really more of like conceptualizing the interconnectivity between internal and external services, right? And I think as what Ziheng mentioned earlier, prior to API first, that's code first, right? And I think it's wouldn't really call it the tougher way, but it's more of like welding together fragmented pieces together in a cumbersome way, fragile way across. So I think just to summarize, really, it's just more of being the interconnection between internal and external services through the APIs.
Okay, so the next question is, why should companies strive to be API first? So that's the first part. And the second part is, and then how do they then go from being code first to API first?
Yeah, I can take the first part. Yeah, so just to reiterate, I think what Chng mentioned previously, I think especially in crypto industry, being API first is quite important due to like transparency. I think this is quite important. There are some exchanges, they don't really share their API keys, like Biget. I think that's probably due to like wash trading. Some other analytics providers and platform, they're unable to get the APIs. So I think that just defeats the purpose of it being transparent, which is really important. Cause like your open interest can be like faked. So like the total volume across like all derivatives exchanges might be skewed in a certain way that is not reliable anymore. So yeah, I think just to come back to like why should companies be like API first is I think in this industry, after what has happened to FTX, transparency is like really key. So yeah.
Totally agree on the transparency, and I also think, yeah, you need to share your API to stay competitive in the industry. Because let's say if I'm a bank and my customer is applying for a loan at another company, I have to support by sharing my customer's data to the lender. And if I don't do that, I'm losing my competitiveness in the industry, and my customers would when they just move to another bank. And also, I think it's just an extremely like developer friendly way, right? Like so that my employees don't have to spend thousands of hours writing their own codes if I'm by becoming an API first industry. So yeah, just that developer friendly nature is also super important. Yeah, and what's the second question?
The second question is, how does a company go from being code first to API first?
I'm not a coder myself, so I'm just going to leave this question to more capable hands. But I do think this is a question you should think about before you start your company, right? Because it requires a lot of upfront planning, like trying to really think about what kind of question you are trying to solve, what are the business and technical requirements you might be facing. And because once you start building a company, it's extremely challenging to move from a code first company into API first company.
Great, thanks for sharing. Mackenzie.
Right. So I think the first question is around why should companies strive to be API first company, right? So I think on that part, I think it really depends on what sort of like vertical you're in. And I think what YJ mentioned, transparency is definitely a very important thing in this modern day, right? But the next question here, it's if you are from a different landscape, time to deployment it's most of the time a pretty important part. So the reason why I mentioned this is because so I was actually an ex-founder in one of the deep tech companies, Data is still live now. It's more of like a machine learning, kind of like a no-code machine learning platform, right? So I think at the point of time when we first started, it's more code-based, right? And I think most of my tech team or the CTO is spending hours of them to kind of like debug different code base and all that, right? So and I think if you have like GitHub, which I think most people would be more familiar about, typically in a code first, you would have a lot of contributes from people and commits, right? And I think some part of it there's a lot of noise because most of the time we probably don't merge them. So I think in this sense, the tech team kind of spend a lot of time on it, and I think in terms of integration with other companies, it's not as much as well, right? So I think in this modern day, I think time to market is pretty important. Transparency is very important, as what YJ mentioned. So I think this is definitely something that potential founders or even developers would have to kind of like pay more attention to. And I think as what mentioned, Ziheng mentioned as well, I think, you know, you would have a little bit more time to innovate around sort of like the frameworks that you're looking at, right? And that would increase developer experience, and that of course, yeah, pretty much that's more of the key pointers, I think, personally. And I think for the next question is, how do you go about being code first or API first? So yeah, I mean, I'm by no means a developer myself as well. But just coming from my experience where I've kind of like observed my core team, then it's really more of like, you know, for API first, you really need to kind of like have a different strategy across, right? Like, you know, what sort of like API stakeholders you're gonna look at, right? The kind of initiative, you know, the kind of contract they have. And I think one of the more key things around transparency as well, it's also governance, and how do you kind of make it across to like automation and stuff, right? So I think high level, these are just some of the things that I've monitored across. But yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so for the second section for this panel, I want to look at present macro trends. So from your point of view, the different VCs here today, what are current VC funding trends for open source startups or API first companies?
Yeah, right. I think I'm definitely a lot more familiar with like crypto VC space. And I think the valuation or like the macro trends for a lot of the venture deals that we are seeing doesn't just affect like other non-open source or non-API first. It affects across the board. So like talking about open source startups, I think other than Solana startups, a lot of these protocols or infrastructure projects that we have seen are all open source. I think it's more of a macro thing, and also the nature of crypto market, where we've seen like a severe sell down from like all-time highs of like 60+ K BTC and like ETH at around 4K to like the current prices right now. So naturally, the valuation of primary market has to correct as well. The problem of the current investment space in crypto is that you have a lot of venture funds who are crowding to invest in different venture projects. So of course, the valuation of that might seem a bit higher, especially during bull market. But the industry, the crypto industry, you don't really have a lot of like liquid focus hedge funds that will buy these tokens in the open market. So what happens to this is that a lot of these funds, they're forced to become sellers because their investors will redeem, or the fund will eventually close down after 5 to 7 years to return all the investors their capital. So the valuation of crypto deals right now, we are seeing, it used to be for seed round probably like 30 to 50 million. Now I'm seeing deals at around 5 to maybe 15 million at most. And a lot of the DeFi protocols, most funds that I talk to, they won't even invest, even if it's a 10 million valuation. Because if you look at existing open source like DeFi protocols, they are not even reaching like a valuation of like more than 10 million when their tokens are getting listed. The appetite just isn't there. For API first, if it's more data analytics driven, probably they still can raise at a decent valuation. Say they want to create like a CoinGecko of like NFT space. There will still be appetite because it's still pretty unique and there's no clear market leader yet. Then sure, API first companies, their valuation probably doesn't correct more than 50% by just half. So yeah, I'm not sure if you are seeing the same trends on your end.
Yeah, I think agree with what YG said. It's more like an industry sentiment, right? We're seeing almost every industry getting affected, valuation being cut down. I think for Web2 fintech, maybe not a big drop as Web3, just because I think the hype for Web3 was too high last year. So by comparison, you have like a 50% valuation drop. But definitely, yeah, we are seeing the drop in the valuation, and everybody is turning from formal to being extra cautious these days. Yeah, but especially in, I would say, more cash burning industries, you know, you have your grocery delivery, which is just very cash burning by nature. I think those are the ones of getting affected the most. I would say API is somewhat in a safe space just because it's a very capex-led business. There isn't a lot of operating cost involved besides your R&D. So they are somewhat safe in a way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mackenzie, what are some current VC funding trends you see?
Yeah, I think you know, Ziheng and YJ probably cover most of like the macro side of things. I mean, we definitely do see a correction in valuation. But you know, I just kind of like recently heard this, but I'm not too sure if YJ and Ziheng will kind of agree. It's you know, we realized that the top 5% of the you know, I would say projects or startup out there, they're doing pretty well. Actually didn't really have much of their valuation affected, mainly because of what YJ mentioned, that when there's a lot of venture fund coming into it, a lot of support around it. But on the other hand, you know, the bottom 50% of the startups, it's either, you know, raising money right now because they need to extend their runway, you know, being for like 24 to 36 months, depending, to kind of ride out the whole bull market. On the other hand, I think that's what Ziheng mentioned. From an API perspective, I think it's really just more of like, you know, the strategy across monetization, right? And I think what sort of like the problems that you know, the startups actually solving, because I think what we do see now from a project basis is that a lot of founders are actually, you know, head down developing their product, getting a lot of like user interviews, improve the UI UX, which may or may not prove to be a cutting edge across, right, when the market recovers. So yeah, pretty much I think that's more of like a add on to what Ziheng and YJ mentioned across earlier.
Thank you. Okay, so from your experiences, what are you as a VC looking for in open source or API first projects? Like, what are some of your considerations? What do you look into before deciding to invest?
Yeah, I think I'll go first. For open source projects, we definitely prefer to invest in teams and projects that will prioritize being open source. I think this is extremely important, especially if the project is a DeFi protocol. One of our major concerns when Solana projects was getting a lot of traction was that they're actually not really open source. A lot of their code base are not shared publicly. So I think that creates a lot of risk. And you guys have probably seen quite a bit of news is that Solana DeFi protocols are kind of like a bit more prone to being attacked. And it also creates unhealthy kind of like a bug bounty or white hack program. So a lot of the black hat hackers will probably, from what we've understood, like kind of target Solana DeFi protocols as compared to like EVM chain ones. And this is like one of the biggest concerns, because like once a DeFi protocol gets exploited, then like the trust just kind of goes to zero. For like API companies, yeah, I think Mackenzie brought up a really good point. Is that a lot of these API first companies, they try to focus a lot more on like tapping on different platforms API and then trying to better data storytell to their own users using these data analytics. But what they are unable to do, and also partly because it's a bear market, is to monetize it. So like the SaaS business model is not as attractive as what we see like 1.5 years, 1 year ago. Probably you have seen Nansen raising at like a 700 million valuation, but it might be tough for them to like even have an expansion round at the same valuation. So if they need capital, they probably have to do a down round, etc. That's just because like subscription model in a space will also get severely affected where there are lesser people being in a space, and the subscription fee is also pretty high. So yeah, also you.
Yeah, I think totally agree. Biggest concern for us, especially for I guess open source is just on the monetization. I guess in Web2, of course, you have super successful open source projects like Kubernetes, like TensorFlow, and I think they all managed to find a way to monetize, like via paid services or paid extensions. So, you know, this very project-based or consulting-based fees or like SaaS services or ecosystem approach. So I think just the way to think about monetization for open source projects is very important for us. Yeah, and then I think for both open source and API, I think this is it boils down to your engineering excellence, right? Because the end product delivery is very simple. Like for Stripe, they're very famous for their 7 line of codes. So you just it's takes you minutes to integrate the Stripe payment gateway into your online shop. But I'm sure in the back end they have thousands or if not more codes internally to make the payment processing work. So just that kind of, and that's how you eventually compete with other players in the space, just by being engineering excellence to make sure you keep your downtime at the lowest, to make sure that security and the compliance, everything is at a high standard, to make sure that everything runs smoothly. Yeah.
Mackenzie?
Yeah, so I think for us in a open source project, I think the very first thing is definitely the team behind it. Because I think for most cases, I mean, just taking me for example, right? Back then when I was scaling my startup, I think it's always easier to explain an API related kind of like task or project to me than open source. So I think at some level the team has to be technically proven, or like what someone mentioned, is more of like engineering excellence around it. Because I think once you move into that space, firstly, what you mentioned about security, which is always a key issue that we face in the Web3 scene. The next thing is also in terms of like commit and all, you have like various of people of different levels contributing to your repo, right? And for that itself, the team has to be technically inclined to be able to read out noise like this, right? So I think these are some things that we kind of like would definitely dive in a little bit deeper as well, and also just perhaps look at the code review as well to just see sort of the things that they do. And I think for API, it really opens up another sort of like avenue, right? In terms of like client acquisition, because I mean, if you're asking someone who's a very business related guy or has been in the business for quite a fair bit, and you tell them about open source projects, they probably would not understand as quickly as they do, right? So I think it's really more of like sort of the problems that they're trying to solve, and is this something that's been facing both on the technical side and on the business side, and in terms of like the flywheel, basically to get the sort of momentum across to be able to scale further, with limited capabilities in this current market. I think these are some of the key pointers that we will kind of like dive in deeper and then to see if it's gonna be a good fit for us.
Okay, thanks, Sin. Could you share with us some examples of open source or API first companies that you've successfully invested in? Beginning by Jay.
Yeah, sure. So mentioned previously, for API first company we have invested in will be Levitas. The valuation where we entered previously was still pretty cheap. Don't really think that the bear market has affected it by much. So I know quite a lot of like pro traders and even retail traders quite like to use Levitas to just have an aggregated platform to look across all crypto derivatives related data. For open source company, we were the lead investors in DYDX for their Series B. So I think it's just a very classic and good example of a Silicon Valley kind of tech team where they're building like a world-class DeFi protocol. And they don't just stop at that. If you look at the updates for version 4, they're also trying to build their own layer 1 on Cosmos, which should be live start of second half this year. So I think their ethos and what they're trying to build consistently since the start was something that we believed in, and they have successfully executed it. Probably just the main concern that what people have right now is that the unlocks schedule for their venture investors are pretty aggressive. So it's for this year, it's a pretty high inflationary token. Yeah.
So we invested in Financier, which is a leading open banking API player in the region. So what they do is basically they consolidate all your banking and banking data, payment data, so you can use for like loan underwriting, KYC, verification, and different use cases. And another company that I really liked is called Smile API. So what they're doing is employment data verification, because in most countries in Southeast Asia, the bank coverage is actually very low. So even though open banking business model works really well in like developed markets, but in Southeast Asia, there's still very limited coverage. But employment is something almost everybody has. So what this company does is it lets your employers to share your employment data with lenders, banks, insurance companies for like verification purpose. So that you can easily open bank account or applying for insurance product. And I really like the vision because it has a like financial inclusion angle in it.
Mackenzie?
Yeah, on our end, let me just keep the pattern going. I'll just start with the API one first. I think Luna Crush, it's one of the company invested. I think they're more towards like sentiment analysis kind of play. So they basically have like like a API integrated, where potentially you can just integrate the different sort of platforms on there, to help make a little bit more to basically get like real-time insights and to make a little bit more informed crypto investment decisions. And I think for that itself, the traffic flow has been really healthy so far. And on the other hand, for open source, we invested in this company called Grid, GRID, or they call it like Brishna.io. So it's actually like a no-code, platform for game dev. So I think this is one of the companies that's pretty interesting because I think they were mainly more in the Web2 space, but then only kind of pivoted into Web3, mainly because I think of the kind of like the game scene kind of like boom. So for that itself, I think they are slowly, transiting into an API related, because at the very beginning at the open source part, to basically get up the modularized no code gaming, game dev stuff, that's basically what they need, right? Because they need a bit of contributions and suggestions basically from end users on how they basically would be able to kind of like increase productivity, efficiency, integrability as well. But once they kind of like have sort of firm up their structure, and then they're moving towards the API where they're basically going to integrate this across to different potentially gaming studios, or just stay as it is, right? So as of now, I think that's one of the more interesting use cases for both ends, and I think they have pretty good I would say traction so far, because they kind of like invested in them pretty early, backed by Bill Ackman, Paris Hilton, and Randy Zuckerberg just last year. So I think this is one of the more interesting companies that that's kind of like fits this open source and API kind of like concept. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the examples of the startups you've invested in. The next question is, do any of you think that like what do you guys think is missing in the API first area, or like open first, like open source companies? Is there anything you see missing in the API first space?
So this is a personal pain point that I had 1 or 2 years ago. Like I was helping review some API documentations for some of the largest banks in Singapore. Like DBS, OCBC, they all have their API documentation published online. You can read, which the documentation was done back in maybe 2016, 17, and they never update. So, but internally, their database probably have iterated a few times, and then it just created this huge discrepancy between their internal tech architecture and the documentation, API documentation published, because it's already very outdated. And I think that's just one of the biggest pain point in the market. Like so many banks, they are either required or advised by the government to open their API, but they are just doing a very bad job. And that created a lot of pain points or became very time consuming for the fintechs when they do have to work with the banks. They ended up spending a lot of time actually figuring out what the API documentation is.
Yeah, I can dive a bit deeper into something different. I think one of the pain points, I think as a avid NFT collector, would be that Blur and X2I2 actually kind of has a wall where they don't share like their APIs, or as in X2I2 doesn't share the API with like Blur. So the pain point is that you have to use both Gem and Blur to look through like what's the best floor price across like different collections. So I think the problem is that, and this doesn't just apply to NFT companies, but like even exchanges as well, is that I think some of the competition might get a bit toxic, and they don't really have the interest of like the end users in mind. So hopefully we can see a bit more of a collaborative mindset across these companies. So yeah.
I think I think YJ would have covered a couple of crypto native tenants on the web too. So I think for myself, it's just more of like somewhere in between, right? Because I think recently in the whole India taxation, I think the government's trying to clamp down a bit more on like the crypto tax, and what I realized that's kind of missing, it's really more of like the financial API at the back end to basically convert like complex I would say transaction across into something that what normalized accountants would see, right? And I think that's one of the things that we have seen more recently, but we have yet to actually see someone that's a market leader across. And yeah, I mean, just fitting in the bill.
Okay, well, the next question is, how can API first companies or open source companies play a part in the different industries that they shape today?
Wow. Yeah, I think just going back, so for API first companies, I think it will still be relatively like standard and common across like different industries. I think ultimately like you need to maintain like the standard of like transparency so that end users are able to better protect or like benefit itself, and not just from like a centralization or business profitability point of view. And with that in mind, I think across the board, like API first companies will then be able to like truly grow and scale quickly. Yeah.
I think any industry that relies on the collaboration with other sectors will benefit a lot, like finance, insurance, healthcare, telco, e-commerce. And I think these are all some of the sectors that API can play a big role. And personally, I'm more look forward to how APIs can help shorten the development cycle, and just make it much faster to go live for a lot of the product features. I think, for example, when COVID first hit, the MOH was just doing a great job in fast response, doing the vaccine tracker or the COVID trackers for your SingPass. And in China, they did the same thing. So basically the feature was quickly went live in a few days, where you can even like scan the QR code, in each location, or update your COVID vaccine status in your WeChat or Alipay, all the super apps, and all those mobile apps, on the back end is supported by hundreds of internal and external APIs to make the feature work. And I'm just look forward to how API can help bring into life more this kind of examples. Just basically you have such a short turnaround time to bring like super important features.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we look at like how there could be more collaboration, how things could be faster, more efficient. Mackenzie, anything else to add on on how API first companies or open source companies can shape different industries?
Yeah, I think it really falls back to what API is. What API first is really more of like communicating across request and response between internal and external API, right? So I think in terms of different vertical, I know what I feel that has not been mentioned is really more in the AI ML space. Because I think ML with the neural networks in there, it's really a powerful tool, that would potentially help, not just in crypto, fintech, but, just in economic comms, logistics and all that stuff. So I think on top of that itself is really just more collaborative, basically integrating a sort of like vertical into a more vastly kind of I would say adopted, right? So let's say like fintech and let's say crypto or Web3 related. If we could see more integrations with AI and ML into that would be awesome. And I think all this is really key and important, mainly more from a API perspective, because this would allow the sort of like the bridging across that. And I think from there, what we do see, it's going to be more interesting. I would say it's really just down to creativity, right? How are you going to kind of improve sort of like, I would just say it's more of like a testing environment as well, sometimes. And yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mackenzie. Yeah, the three panelists have shared with us a lot about API first and open source companies and approach. In closing, we want to hear from the three of you. What is your view on the future of API first or open source companies?
Yeah, so I think being in crypto, an open source first company will always be extremely important for not just the sake of the companies, but for the industry and definitely the end users. Is that the security is we think it's quite important. So it'd be good to like just open source everything, not just for the sake of like security auditors like Certic or like Quantstamp, etc. But really to put users security and benefit above others. Because I myself and most people will probably have gotten exploited or run through like a certain DeFi protocol. So I think with that in mind, I do see that the importance of being open source first is extremely important, and hope that this will continue to like the next cycle. What we don't really want to see is where a non-EVM chain, say like Solana, or maybe when say Sui network is like up and live, we hope that developers in this particular ecosystems will not make their code base closed source, and I think that would be like detrimental to like the ecosystem. Yeah.
I think agree the security is super important. I heard in Indonesia a lot of the end users, they don't like sharing their bank data to other apps when being asked, because they feel it's not safe when their data is being like transmitted through API. So I think there's just a lot of those stereotypes about the because there has been several hacks happened through the API, and also hope to see more just standardization of the API in the industry, more push from the government, and yeah, that's all I can think of it right now.
Mackenzie?
Yeah. So I think for open source, yes, I think I do agree with what YJ that like with the next wave of development, I think security transparency is definitely a key thing that we have to look at. And also I think this is one of the things that would think that's super important in terms of like a development perspective, right? But having said that, for the API side of things, is really more of like integration across, sort of like cross channels or even different verticals, right? So having said that, I think to all listeners, participants or whatnot, I think for the fact that you are gonna decide which sort of like open source or API really depends on what sort of a use case you're looking at, right? I think what YJ and Ziheng mentioned is really just more of a very niche sort of vertical. So I think, you know, just want to keep in mind that these are sort of the strategies that you have to go across, and sticking across to it, which is also very important. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mackenzie. With that, comes to the end of this, the first panel. Thank you for everyone here today and tuning in on site, and as well as to our panelists, Mackenzie, YJ, and Ziheng.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. Happy New Year to everyone.
Yeah, yes. Okay, wait. Can I check? Do you have time for like a short?
Yeah, we should not just like if anyone has any questions.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So if anyone, is it also online or is that no?
Yeah, anyone
Right.
can.
If anyone on site or online have a question,
Yes.
yeah, I think online site, the NUS site is going to help facilitate. If anyone has a question, maybe just let us know your question, and if it's directed to any of the panelists here.
Yeah. Does anyone have that? I just want to go and take the mic. Yeah, I just pass to them. So does anyone have any questions with regards to the questions? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, you can just intro yourself.
Hi, so I'm Raman, Year 1 CS NUS. So my question is like there are a lot of fields nowadays in fintech itself. There's blockchain, there's a lot of stuff to do in a lot of fields. So for like new students or newcomers to the industry, would you recommend having like a broad skill set, or like specialize and focus on one thing? Like, do you understand my question? So
Okay, so I guess this, like, we have a general question here is, do the panelists recommend individuals, maybe it's like a note of encouragement to the students, like what do you see as like, should students focus on like a broader skill set, or like a generalist approach or a specialist approach, if I'm understanding it right?
yeah, inside like this industry specifically.
Okay, so yeah, I guess in both like the Web 2 and Web 3 space, I guess you all could share your views. What do you all see more of, like generalists that you work with, or specialists?
Yeah, probably I can take this. I think it really depends on what you study. I think if you're like a computer science major and you're pretty good at like coding, then at least in the bull market, now some companies still can afford these kind of salaries, is that they prefer like specialized developers and engineers. So quite a lot of developers I know, at least those who went from like EVM to like Rust, I think their pay band was quite significant. And then eventually they move on to like say Mr. Labs, who is building Sui. So I think they got a slight bump as well, because Move is quite similar to like Rust. So I think for that you have to be specialized. I think for business analytics or like business intelligence, I think it can be like broader scope. You don't have to just limit yourself to like data analytics, like API companies. In fact, like funds like us, we actually prefer people to have experience in that, because like you can build your own Dune analytics dashboard, and that really helps us to like track across like all layer 1s and layer 2s, like their growth rate, total transactions, like how many wallets are being created, etc. So you can like use those skills to be like an investor as well. I think that's really important to be like a bit more general. But if you are like a developer, I think it's probably better to like stick to like probably one or two like specific languages. Yeah.
Mackenzie or Ziheng, any thoughts to share about being
Yeah,
a
I think
generalist or a specialist?
Yeah, I think it's really more being a specialist and be really good at it. Because you know, once you have sort of like diving a bit deeper, you know sort of like the thing that you kind of like would be able to kind of read out noise in a way, right? When you kind of like speak with people who doesn't has that much or like a very high level understanding of what they're trying to do. And I think as what YJ mentioned, that itself is more like towards the web, I think Web 3 side, right? The Web 2 side is always like front end, back end, and full stack and stuff like that. So you realize that, you know, to be a full stack, it's also not easy because you need to have an understanding. So it's really just down to what you really find passionate about, and then kind of like go in a bit deeper and be really good at what you specialize in. And then, that's sort of like the viewpoints that you have, or basically the framework that you're going to design in the future is just going to be different because your key considerations is going to be, a bit different as well. So yeah, specialize.
Right, I think we have like a time for maybe one or two more questions if anyone on site or online.
Yeah, okay, one there.
Okay, so then there's one on site and then we have
Online?
one online.
One online,
Right,
so
and that
we'll
should
see. Let's see if it's the same type of question. Let's see how it goes.
Hi, this is Cleon from the Fintech Society. And this question is open to anyone on the panel. Yeah, so my question is, do you think API first companies will help or hurt the regulatory environment, either in crypto or in startups? Because like, for example, a code first company, you only have a single code base to review, and anything that can go wrong is within that code base that has to be reviewed. Whereas for API first companies, there are a lot more moving parts, especially if we are using like external APIs, which any of these moving parts can go rogue. So my question is, do you think API first companies will help or hurt the regulatory environment?
Will API first companies help or hurt regulatory environment? Okay, that's our first question. All right, shall we take the online question as well? Then we can.
Is it a similar?
Okay, if not, we can just answer this question first. Yeah. Any thoughts on?
Our answer will be very different.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had like a brief chat with one of our portfolio companies regarding this. I think, and this is only just specific to crypto, would be that actually for API first companies for exchanges, most of them are trying to be that, like Bybit, Binance, OKX. But there are some upcoming ones. They're not very they're not really API first companies. So I think that actually hurts them on a regulatory, from a regulatory standpoint. Because why are they not like API first companies is because like what I mentioned previously, like number one will be like wash trading. So some exchanges they're not very keen to share like what's the real organic volume, and it's pretty hard for like other platforms to like sieve out what's the real actual user traded volume. So I think on that end, investors and so traders should probably avoid these kind of like platforms on exchanges to trade on, and also regulators will probably come down hard on them, because these exchanges are not doing something that's fair play, right? And it hurts the users. So you might, and if the exchange volumes are not real, and you're trading derivatives perps on there, they might have like crazy wicks, and regulators should actually come down to claim them hard on them. So being API first, I think at least from exchange perspective, it should be like one of the number one priorities, even though they might look bad and like the exchange volume isn't as good as like other established like players. So yeah.
I think there are two kinds of situations. One is if you're just being a pure service or technology provider, let's say like in a lot of open banking APIs case, you are just aggregating the API published by the banks, right? And you're just passing the information from one bank to another. You don't get involved in the money movement. You don't do the on-ramp, off-ramp yourself. And they are more or less always get green lighted by the regulators anyway, just because they are pretty much a software company. They don't really get involved in the money movement. But then I think in the exchanges case, by what YG mentioned, if you do get involved in the money movement yourself, yes, being transparent with regulators is number one priority. And in that case, I do think just publish your API, being API friendly helps you a lot with regulators.
Mackenzie, anything to add?
Yeah, I think they've probably covered both, right, on the Web 2, Web 3 side. I think would only probably be clamped down hard if they're trying to do something being like an outlier, trying to do something different, or they're trying to be less transparent in a more, I think, centralized sort of things. But if you're looking from a financial API backend, which basically helps improve workflow of productivity, I definitely don't see that happening anytime soon, basically jumping down.
Yep. Okay. Thanks for sharing. All right.
Okay.
Now we have
Do we-
an online question.
Do we have enough time? The next question is like something more relevant. It's by Kai Lin. She actually asked, how did FTX and Terra Luna collapse impact investment in the crypto industry? And in this case, how would regulators like help in this case? So
Okay, so two parts to the questions.
Yeah,
FTX and Luna, I guess Web3 friends here would be most helpful. And of
so it's
course,
quite a lot
regulation.
of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge load.
Yeah, so I'm quite familiar with this whole thing, because we are actually in the lawsuit against Three Arrows court-appointed liquidators, because we used to share the same IMFC license as them. So yeah, I think this is quite a heavy question. So I think there are two parts to it. I don't think regulators can do anything much, honestly, for Luna. I mean, they probably can try, but if you read the white paper and how Luna and UST works, the chance of it failing was actually pretty high. But because Do Kwon and TFL spent so much money to keep buying back and trying to repack UST previously, people thought that you will always succeed. But he just basically ran out of funds and couldn't repack it anymore. I'm not sure if there was somebody out there that actually tried to hunt these positions and try to make sure that UST collapse. I personally don't think so, because it means that the domino effect, as what we are seeing right now, will happen, and it affects like everyone, not just like Three Arrows, but like FTX and also DCG, which is like Genesis digital currency group. So I think regulators can definitely help users in both Three Arrows and also FTX case. Probably on FTX was that they don't have like a one-to-one backed exchange kind of policy, right? They were Alameda Research was probably like super leveraged long, which is what Three Arrows did. Three Arrows tried their best to borrow from every single one that they could until they couldn't post any more collateral, which is why all the centralized counterparties had to liquidate a position, which is why in June you see BTC and ETH had like ETH was like nuked all the way to like 888. And that's because most of the major counterparties were like liquidating their positions during that week that they became insolvent. Regulators can definitely play a part to demand to see the balance sheet of FTX, because not everybody will be crypto native enough to look at their on-chain balances. So that kind of happened over the weekend when the CoinDesk article came out, and we thought that their reserve was low because they probably cashed out a lot of USDC into fiat, and then the banks were closed in the US on the weekends. But if the regulators could have stepped in and said that they probably didn't, because the regulators will know how much fiat that they have in different banks, then users will definitely know that FTX is not fully backed one-to-one, which really hurts people as well. But I think Singapore's case, regulation, I think that's a different story when it comes to US regulators, because MAS kind of didn't really want Singapore-based users to use Binance, which is why a lot of people use FTX, and a lot of my friends got a lot of money stuck there. So it's pretty sad story to hear. I think moving forward, I think Binance, I personally really do trust Binance quite a bit, and I think CZ has done a great step to ensuring that the Merkle tree proof of reserve is back one-to-one, and everything can be seen on-chain, and Nansen is helping that as well. So I think that's a good fair play from both of these companies, and a lot of these things can be done as long as there's a right leader in place in these kind of companies. For regulators to come in to audit exchanges, it might be tough for a Big Four auditor to come in to audit as well, because we have worked with some of them, and it's true that they might take a while to like learn all the auditing processes. So I think in this space, you just need to guard up yourself and also trust yourself more, and then slowly over time, then build relationship with other people and then to trust them. So yeah.
Okay, thanks for sharing. We are running a little short on time. Maybe if Mackenzie, do you have any other any few words to add on regulators?
Yeah, I think YJ pretty much did a very he did a great job, just explaining how comprehensive it is. But I think, personally, I think it's more of like once I think the regulators definitely take a closer look at this, and with this, I think it's also one step ahead for us, in the Web3 space, that is slowly getting more traction or adoption across, right? Because once you have sort of like regulations on it, more people is going to be open to it and stuff. But I think the main key thing here is really, with the whole FTX and the Luna collapse, is really not about the issues with blockchain fundamentally. It's just really more about like the risk management issues on the side. So yeah, I mean, just adding on a bit of a opinion on top of what YJ had just kind of like explained across.
Okay, thanks for sharing. And with that, it comes to the end.
Yeah.
The NUS.
Yeah, so I think that kind of concludes our first panel discussion for today. So I think what we want to do now is actually to first thank you for sharing with us your thoughts about actually quite a few questions about this investment landscape, in open source and API first companies. What I would like to do is to get our external departments to, of course, give a token of appreciation to you all. For Mackenzie, we'll see how we can get it to you. Yeah. Not sure how, but we'll try. So what we have here is a goodie bag as well as the travel tumblers. So this is like, hopefully, when you go out, you can just bring along water. Yeah, Singapore is a bit hot. Do we have enough for everyone? Okay, great. Yeah. So meanwhile, just could we give another round of applause for their sharing? Yeah, and thank you, Mackenzie, too, as well.
Thank you.